to look at the final project, and I'm going to demonstrate with an example from the survey that you all took in the beginning of the semester. So I will share my screen here. Okay, so we're looking at the yes and no responses to whether or not a student has driven or ridden in an electric car. So my question to you, all of you in the class, was have you driven or ridden in an electric car? And we can see the responses here. I had 17 who said yes and 69 who said no. So the total number of successes had been 17 and the total number surveyed had been 86. So anyway, back to the project. First thing is develop the question. So you're going to develop a question that has a clear yes or no answer for this project. Next, we're going to select the population that we'll be sampling from, the population that we want to determine the responses from. So in my case, the population would be the HAC students. So all HAC students are my population that I'm selecting a sample from, and I'm hoping that my sample represents all HAC students. That's the second part of the project. The third part is to make a hypothesis about what you expect to find regarding that population. So I'm suggesting you use 50% as your null hypothesis, that the proportion is 50%, and then your hypothesis should be that it's either greater than that or less than that. And for me, even before I asked this, I assumed that less than half of my students, or half of HAC students, I should say, would have driven or ridden in an electric car. So my hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis, is that the proportion will be less than 50% for the population of all HAC students driving an electric car or riding in an electric car. Okay, the fourth part is to actually go out and collect the sample. So you're going to do this however it works best for you. You want to try to be as representative of your population as possible. Now, in my example, I would say that I failed at that because I used a convenient sample. I asked my students, who are probably not representative of all HAC students, because first of all, they're only HAC students that have to take statistics, so that's limiting. They're only HAC students who are taking the course online, again limiting, and they're only the ones that are in my class and chose to respond to the survey, because a few people didn't. So definitely a faulty sampling plan there. And that's okay as far as this project is concerned, as long as you acknowledge that. So make sure that if your sampling process was not representative and random, that you acknowledge that and let us know what was wrong with that. Okay, next we're ready to perform a hypothesis test to see if we can make the claim that fewer than 50% of HAC students have driven in or ridden in an electric car. So to do that, we'll go to stat and proportion stats and one sample. And in this case, we have the summary. So the number of successes we found, or I found, were 17, and the total number of observations was 86. My null hypothesis, HO, is that the proportion is equal to 50%, and my alternative hypothesis, what I believe, is that the proportion is actually less than 50%. And I don't think we need to mark anything else there, so let's go ahead and compute, and we find from the hypothesis test that the sample proportion from our group was 0.197, so about 20% of the sample have in fact ridden in or driven an electric car. We also find the z-test statistic is negative 5.6, and we find the p-value to be smaller than 0.0001. So that's a very small p-value. What does that mean? Well, from that p-value, I can reject my null hypothesis and conclude that fewer than 50% of all HAC students have in fact ridden in or driven an electric car. Okay, so that would be my conclusion. Next, we're going to construct a confidence interval. So actually, I can do that from the same page. So I can just go back here and edit And notice that you have the option to turn on a confidence interval for the proportion as well. I believe I asked you to do a 95% confidence interval, so we don't have to change anything there. And we'll go ahead and compute. Okay, and we can see the lower limit for the confidence interval is 0.11350595, so 11.4% if we round that to the nearest tenth of a percent, to an upper limit of 28.2%. So I am 95% confident that the true proportion of HAC students who have ridden in or driven an electric car is between 11.4% and 28.2%. Notice that I'm not saying the proportion of my sample is between those values. I know exactly what the proportion was for my sample. It was 0.197674442. I know that precisely. When we make hypothesis tests and when we make confidence intervals, we're using that sample to represent the population and make a statement about the population. So I'm not saying anything about my sample. I'm using my sample to say something about the population of all HAC students. Okay, as far as describing what you've learned about the population, well, in this case, I confirmed what I believed, which was that most students, more than half, have not driven in an electric car or driven an electric car or ridden in an electric car. Some ideas for further study. I would certainly like to see how this changes over time. So 5 years from now, take a survey again and compare it to this one. And I think I'll find more people have. I'm almost certain that I would find that more people have driven or ridden in an electric car at that point. That's one thing I could do. I could also compare maybe male students to female students. Maybe more male students have done this because, you know, stereotypically we think males are more interested in cars than females. So that's another possible thing I could look into. All right, I hope you enjoy the project. I am looking forward to reading them. So I will see all of them in a week or so.